Okay, I was dealing with when we adjourned the matter that the question of the intersex people wasn't adequately addressed in the legislation, and that hopefully we can at committee stage deal with that and add to it to make this the best possible piece of legislation that we can in this House. Because discussions about psychiatrists aside, it's clear that some of the intersex people may feel a designation as male or female on their birth cert would not accurately reflect the facts of their birth, and as I mentioned, they would prefer a non-binary system for registering their gender. No adequate reason for the lack of the provision of a non-binary identity has been given, and the only thing that comes to mind is that the Minister wasn't able to come up with the scheme, or that at this stage that it was just set aside and we'll deal with it at another stage. My preference, as I said, is that we need to deal with it now, and that we've had enough time in which to come up with mechanisms that will address that, and there are examples internationally which show how that can be done. Minister, previously you have said in relation to an amendment on this aspect that the recognition of non-binary, intersex and transgender people is not within the scope of the bill. I think it was in the Shannon that you were addressing an amendment, and that would require additional changes. So the idea is that when something like that is brought to your attention, or the department's attention, is that you use the space between the Shannon and the Dáil to come up with a piece of legislation. It is within the scope of the bill because it is the Department of Social Protection deals with the civil registration also, and in some ways you can put anything within the scope of the bill. Sometimes it's just a matter of changing the title to ensure that the long title to ensure it captures that. To give effect to a change which you might feel isn't within the scope of the bill. I think any of these issues that flow from a gender recognition fall within the scope of the bill and the intention of the bill, and that we should try and capture as much as possible. I wanted to ask the Minister to outline in his wrap-up, what was the consultation, if any, between the officials drawing up this or himself with the intersex community. It's not a very big community, but it is represented by quite a number of groups in Britain, where it's a larger community, and there's a whole list of groups that would have been able to advise of the differences or challenges that they have faced both in Britain, but North America or elsewhere, and the list is quite extensive, and I can go through some of them, the likes of Intersex UK, the Intersex Society of North America. There's others which would be interesting in terms of how they've dealt with legislation, intersex awareness in New Zealand. So they're the groups that should have been linked in with to see how they've raised issues and what were the issues, so that given how small the state is and how small in some ways our island is, that not every one of the issues that would have emerged in other larger populations would necessarily have arisen within Ireland, but that's not to say that they won't arise in the future. So the part of our job as legislators is to try and also capture future issues to ensure that we have legislated for them in advance. I believe that we have an opportunity to be the leader in human rights, and if we don't address those questions in this legislation, that we'll have missed an opportunity A person who is seeking a legal document to assert their identity should not have to go to a medical practitioner to justify their life and health and interventions regarding whether they or how they have transitioned in order to get that legal document. I'd ask the Minister to take note of the fact that gender recognition models across the EU are moving away from medical practitioners and their certification requirements, and that the pathologisation model is also being rejected in more and more EU countries. In September, Denmark introduced new gender recognition laws which were welcomed by Amnesty International as progressive and courageous, and those laws don't require medical evidence or support as part of their gender recognition process. It's simply a matter of completing an administrative process. A gender identity bill was introduced in Malta, and I think Deputy O'Queeve mentioned this, and that included a recognition that applicants would not be required to provide proof of surgical or medical issues in order to assess gender recognition process. I introduced, as I mentioned earlier, and you thanked me, and I welcome that, the Gender Recognition Bill in 2013, and that framework around that bill was based around the Argentinian models, and that incorporated the Yogyakarta principles. I think I got that one right. I'm doing better. They were adopted by a group of human rights experts, including Mary Robinson and also the former Chief Commissioner of Human Rights Commissions in the North, Professor Michael O'Flaherty, in 2006. And those are internationally recognised human rights standards and guidelines that should be applied to any laws on gender identity, and they clearly stipulate that the state should fully recognise and fully respect and legally recognise each person's self-defined gender identity, and that's the key part there, self-defined. Once you involve medical practitioners, then it's been defined by somebody else. The former Council of Europe Commissioner of Human Rights, Thomas Hammerberg, had much to say on this issue also, and also stated that an individual's opinion must be prioritised. So it is, I think, wrong that we are disregarding those human rights experts on this matter in the legislation before us. Last year, the Equality Authority in August recommended that applicants should not be required to produce medical evidence in order to access legal recognition of their gender. And even the HSE, as was mentioned earlier, which are hardly a bastion of the most progressive of institutions within the States, in many ways the most conservative, and they are also where many of the doctors will have to provide the certification in writing. They have said that even they endorse a gender recognition process that places the responsibility for self-declaration on the applicant rather than the requirement on the medical profession. So there's quite a weight of experts and opinion that seems to suggest that the Minister is wrong in his approach, even though he has moved somewhat on this. There's also a broader point to be made here, that, and I wish, to which I acknowledge cannot perhaps be dealt with in the course of this legislature, but it's something that needs to be dealt with by the Minister for Health, and that is that the barriers of accessing medical care for trans people, there's simply not the required level of services for trans people in this state or on the island as a whole, and many are being forced to make journeys within the state, which are quite far apart, but also sometimes outside the state. It's not within your capacity, obviously, to eradicate those problems, and sometimes maybe we won't fully eradicate them because we're a small island, but that's not to say that we shouldn't have an all-Ireland approach similar to the all-Ireland approach that we've taken in terms of children and their health. The recent announcement that there's an all-Ireland approach to children with heart trouble. That shows what can be done. So if there is expertise or that to be found in the north or in the south, that they be shared across the island, and that kind of that we approach it. If we have to bring experts from abroad on occasion, that you approach it kind of on the basis that you have those experts available to all citizens on the island. Further point that needs to be made here is also acknowledged by the Equality Authority, and that is that no other scenario that they've seen where a person has to provide evidence from a medical practitioner for them to access a legal right. It's bizarre. So that adds, if you want, to the weight against kind of what I've been arguing here. Where a person is of the correct age and the relevant statutory officer is themselves satisfied that the person has the capacity to make a decision, it is usually relatively simple matter, kind of in terms of getting married or signing contracts or the likes. Their standing is accepted, whereas gender recognition procedures seem to be different. I also take serious issue with the fact that there is no pathway to legal gender recognition for the children under 16. Young people use their birth certs regularly when enrolling in school and the likes, and there are kind of times when and there will be when that where children should be, young people should be able to change or get proper legal recognition, because leaving them aside and outside the process means that they're at risk of having their trans status outed, and we've seen what has occurred in terms of bullying in schools for various different reasons, and that is potentially what happens. And we already know kind of that quite a lot of transgender people have suffered kind of isolation, bullying, and many have died of suicide as a result, or kind of have had traumatic childhoods and adulthoods because society's approaches. The advice from the Ombudsman for Children on this issue had said that a failure to provide a law for young transgender people is to have their preferred gender recognised renders it more difficult to advance awareness of the serious challenges facing them in school and in other settings. Even where a 16 or a 17-year-old wish to get legal recognition of their preferred gender, the barriers in front of them, I believe, are still very dangerous and will force many of them to wait until they're 18. Generally speaking, parental consent is required, leaving 16 and 17-year-olds in a bizarre situation where they can consent to medical treatment at 16 themselves, but they can't have their gender recognised. So there is a contradiction there. I am seeking clarity from the Minister as to what happens when two legal parents or guardians of a 16-year-old seeking gender recognition. One parent consents and the other doesn't. What happens in that case? The Equality Authority also asked a question when the heads of the bill were published. They said that there was no satisfactory answer given to that question. So it's something kind of whether it's done today when wrapping up or next week at committee, well, I will be posing it again. If kind of the legislation and the Minister insists on not allowing under 16s to decide for themselves, we would also ask that the provisions dealing with consent and the narrow terms on when a court may dispense with a parent's consent be addressed. Again, kind of once you start straying into this, there are complications, there are exceptions, but part of our job is to ensure that we look at the potential exceptions and the difficulties they will pose, and that we change the law to ensure that that's captured. In the Shannon, my party colleagues tabled a motion that would allow for the court not to require parental consent where they refuse to give it. And we are open to correction on this matter, but it would seem that the threshold for dispensing with parental consent is such that it would require a child to be at risk or their welfare in danger, or for the parents to be uncontactable. It doesn't, as far as I can see, account for the scenario where there is no risk to the child, but that their parent or their guardian simply will not or consent to a child entering into the gender recognition process. I have other issues which I haven't managed to get to in relation to the bill. I'll just wrap up by saying that in general I welcome the bill. It is a huge step forward, and I think it is good that it's happening, and I hope that over the next number of weeks that we use the time positively to ensure that we have the best possible outcome in terms of legislation for the future. So once more, I want to, in particular, thank Lydia Foyle for her courage, and all of those who have struggled with the approach of the state to date on transgender issue, and hopefully this is a new dawning for them.
Thank you.